What if we approached early numeracy with the same precision as early reading? In this episode of Magnify Matters, host Craig Simpson is joined by Kelly Norris, Manager of Early Numeracy Research at the Centre for Independent Studies, for a conversation about the growing evidence behind early numeracy screening and why identifying students at risk early can change learning trajectories. Drawing on her experience as an early childhood teacher, researcher and developer of the Early Number Sense assessment, Kelly explores the critical building blocks of mathematical learning and the importance of knowing not just what to assess, but why it matters. Together, Craig and Kelly explore why early numeracy deserves the same evidence-informed attention as early reading, the development of the Early Number Sense assessment and how it helps identify students who may need additional support, why number sense, number relations and number operations are the strongest predictors for future mathematical success, and how the instructional hierarchy provides a practical pathway from acquisition to fluency and ultimately to deeper mathematical thinking. Whether you're teaching foundation, leading a school, or supporting system improvement, this conversation explores how strong foundations in numeracy create better outcomes for every learner. Now join us as we explore what truly matters in education.
Hello everyone and welcome to Magnify Matters. I'm Craig Simpson. I'm hosting this week's session and I'm extremely lucky to be joined by Kelly Norris. Kelly, welcome.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Kelly, we'll have a lot of people out there listening today who might not know what the Centre for Independent Studies is, so I thought let's clear that up straight away. What is it?
Okay, well, sometimes it's described as a think tank, other times as a research organisation, but I work in a very specific team in the Centre for Independent Studies, which is the education team. So we are a not-for-profit organisation, and the remit basically of the education team is to contribute to evidence-based discussion about how we can improve education for outcomes for students, experiences for teachers, how we can better support teachers, how we can influence positive changes to education policy, really so that we can make education in Australia as effective as it can be for the people who matter most, which is, of course, the students that we teach.
Oh, that's brilliant. What a great role to have,
I know,
Kelly.
I'm a bit lucky.
Yeah, that sounds unreal. So you specifically, Kelly, your role within that, can you tell us about the niche that you've found yourself in relation to all of that work?
I am a very niche person, I think. My background is in early childhood teaching, but I have a specific interest and particular expertise in numeracy and in particular learning difficulties in numeracy. So I found myself in the very fortunate position of being approached to join the Centre for Independent Studies at a time when everybody was talking about the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, and in particular that early numeracy check requirement that was in the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, and what that should look like, what should be in it, what we should be testing, how we should be testing it, and what sort of tools we should be using. So my role at the Centre for Independent Studies is very much around early numeracy and in particular early numeracy screening and intervention.
Excellent. Which is why we've come into partnership, because at Sandhurst, this is what we've been looking at as well. So, and I suppose we've become accustomed over the years to the need for a phonics check, and there had been some noise out there about we need something similar for numeracy. So can you tell us a little bit about the ENSA? And for those out there, the ENSA is the Early Number Sense Screener for Australia, which you're involved with, and a little bit about how this came about being developed, because it's been a fair process, I imagine.
Yeah, it has. And just to give a little bit of background, I said that I did train as an early childhood teacher, and when I initially decided to do what I said I'd never do and go back to university and do some postgraduate study, I was looking, and this is, say, 20 years ago, at numeracy screening, because everybody was talking about reading and talking about phonics. Nobody was talking about numeracy, and the need that I was seeing in my classroom and also from talking to other teachers was just as great, if not greater. But the tools weren't there at that time, and to a certain extent, they're still well behind the phonics tools that we have now, although it is definitely catching up. I mean, I remember at that time when I started looking into the research, we still had 10 times more research published about reading difficulties compared to maths difficulties. And that was the best it had ever been. So that's, I think, goes some way to explaining why we're always behind the progress that we make in reading when we talk about the tools that we're using in maths. But the reason that this came about was, as I said, I came into the Centre for Independent Studies at the beginning of 2024. Prior to that, I'd been doing classroom teaching. I'd also been teaching in university in the pre-service teaching program over here in Western Australia, where I'm based. Done some work sort of as a consultant in education. I'd also done some work in product development for multi-lit. So I had quite a broad experience. I felt like I could see everything in education from every perspective. I could see it from a classroom teacher's perspective. I could see it from a parent's perspective. I have my own kids going through school at the moment, one of whom has a learning difficulty in mathematics, ironically. I could look at it from the commercial perspective with product development. So I think that's something that's really been useful coming into this work in the ENSA. So I came in specifically to write this report that became called Screening That Counts, which was about what should we be screening in early numeracy, what should it look like, how should we be doing it, how are other people doing it, what does the evidence say about the best way to predict who is going to struggle with mathematics and numeracy so that we can get in early and provide that intervention. So I looked at lots of international research, lots of international tools, what sorts of features those tools should have, like that they should be predictive. So we're not looking to test everything about a child's early number knowledge because it's not all equally important. And we all know how time poor teachers are and how important it is to preserve instructional time for actually teaching. So it's about being predictive, but also being reliable and being able to be delivered efficiently. And when we looked around at the sorts of tools that we were using in Australia at that time, none of them ticked those boxes about being an effective screener.
And certainly not efficient from what I can gather.
No, and working in WA, and I think it's very similar across many, many systems. I worked as a pre-primary teacher for a period of time, and that's the year before year one in Western Australia. We have an on-entry screener that quite honestly would derail my instructional program for about 3 weeks in first term. And I'm not saying that that information wasn't valuable, but it wasn't all equally valuable and not all at that time that I was required to collect it. So there's a lot of inefficiencies about the way that we're doing early numeracy assessments. So when we had all these conversations and we were catching up with people and reporting to departments about what we'd found in the Screening That Counts report, there was so much enthusiasm. It was like, yes, we know that screening is important. We're doing some good screening in literacy. We want a great screener in numeracy. Where is it? And of course, there wasn't really one. I mean, there are some great international examples, but when you're talking about predicting risk of poor achievement, then that poor achievement, the level of that achievement is dictated by your local curriculum. So it's not as easy as just kind of importing something from another country and saying, let's do it exactly the same way here.
So you had to start from scratch?
I wouldn't say we started from scratch. We were incredibly lucky in that the international research community, a lot of people's work that I had cited in that report, was so generous in supporting us to start work on the ENSA. So we put together an advisory team full of international experts. Some of those have worked on similar tools, like we have Russell Gersten and Ben Clark who worked on the Aspens. We have Erica Lemke who worked on Acadians. So although we were building something from the ground up, we had a lot of really, really good advice.
That's excellent. So does this mean that the ENSA that you've helped produce has the potential then to be more influential globally, do you think, adopted by other countries?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I've just said, and this is perhaps a little bit controversial, but I think your local curriculum expectations do matter. So, for example, some of the research that we're really heavily embedded in at the moment is looking at end-of-year achievement of these children who are doing the screener and which of those children have fallen below the line that we would consider to be expected achievement, for end-of-year expectations. So if that child then went and did schooling in the US or if they did it in UK, would they be at that same level? Would we make that same judgment about whether they'd achieved expectations? So I think if you picked it up and moved it somewhere that had a curriculum with markedly different expectations, you would have to recalibrate that. But having said that, we are doing something quite different to a lot of the international tools that exist, which I think is is relevant more broadly. So particularly the approach we've taken with group administration. So even a lot of the fantastic tools that we looked at and that we've been influenced by are administered one-on-one. So one teacher, one student, the teacher's asking questions, the student is responding, and the teacher is making a record of the student's responses. And you might be able to, in some tools, get that down to less than 10 minutes, but it still takes quite a while to work through a class one-on-one. And even just those transition times between, go and get Jenny or whatever it might be, it eats into your instructional time. So by doing it in a group and doing it digitally, I think that's definitely something that is relevant more broadly.
I have no doubt that our teachers and the people in schools who are responsible for booking CRTs and having to provide time release for teachers to come out and do the screening will be very grateful that you can bring a small group of children out, or even at occasion do it as a whole class thing and significantly reduce the amount of time that a teacher has to be away from her class. So I think that'll be greatly appreciated right across the board.
And that's something we didn't actually expect. When we did the initial year of the research, we said, look, we recommend that you do it in groups of 4 to 6, but ultimately we want you to let us know what works for you. And we found that in particular in year 1, there were some classes that found that they could screen everybody in the class all at once. Now, obviously that required them to have enough touchscreen devices, and they also brought in extra adults to make sure everybody was doing the right thing at the right time and looking at the right screen, and everyone was on track. But that cut the screening time down to half an hour for an entire class.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. When you consider that some of the screening tools we've used in the past have been like 40 minutes per student, that's a significant reduction. So it's one thing to reduce the time taken to perform the assessment, Kelly, but the other bit's the information that it's giving you. And you said that there's some critical things that the ENSA provides, some predictive things that the ENSA provides that other tools didn't. Can you tell us about what are those predictive things? What are the things that the ENSA is assessing for that gives us such leverage into knowing the risk provided for each student as an outcome of having sat that assessment?
So when we're looking for the phonics of maths or the phonics of numeracy, what we're actually looking at is a cluster of kind of interrelated pieces of knowledge about number. So we have number relations, and number operations. That's what fantastic researchers like Nancy Jordan, Devlin, Botello call number sense. So number sense is one of those lofty terms that means different things to different people, but in this context, it means something very specific. So the number subdomain, we're typically pretty good at measuring in early childhood and junior primary classes. So things like number recognition, counting, observing counting principles, being able to count collections, being able to recite the number sequence, that all comes under the subdomain of number. The second subdomain, we are not nearly as good at measuring, and that's a problem because it is actually the most predictive for children with serious difficulties, and that's called number relations. So number relations is about that abstraction in knowing that numbers actually have their own value independent of what's being counted. So we can talk about more and less and closer to and further from and halfway between, and that makes sense because numbers have their own value. So that's not something that we commonly see in a lot of early numeracy assessments. We might say, here's a bunch of counters, here's another bunch of counters, count them, which one is more. But what is really predictive is knowing the value of the numbers themselves, not just with the concrete objects. So that's a big part of what we wanted to put in the screener. And it's been established for quite a long time that children's ability to kind of estimate the magnitude of numbers by popping them on an empty number line is highly predictive of maths achievement, even right throughout primary school. So not in the same number ranges. So if you're looking, for example, at foundation, you'd be looking at a lower number range like 0 to 20. If you're looking at upper primary, you might be plotting fractional numbers on a number line. But it's important right throughout primary school, that number relations. The third subdomain is number operations, and that's the knowledge that numbers are made up of other numbers. Composing, decomposing, taking numbers apart, putting them back together, knowledge of addition and subtraction facts. So that becomes more important in year one. So you've got these three subdomains: number relations, number operations, and you've got the relative importance of those changing as children move through school. So when they're in kindy, for example, number's really important, and to a lesser extent, number relations. When they're in foundation, it's number and number relations are really important, and number operations is becoming important. But by the time they get to year one, number doesn't tell you nearly as much as it used to. The big money is in number relations and number operations. So those are the things that we should really be concentrating our screening on.
Fantastic. So the tool adapts itself to what's required at a particular age group that gives you that indication of risk moving forward.
Yeah, that's right. So it doesn't tell you nearly as much, for example, as sitting down with a child for 40 minutes and doing an individual interview. But it's not designed to. It's designed to tell you the things that matter most for predicting longer term achievement so that you can decide where to put your energy in terms of finding out what's going on.
So we're introducing this for our foundation and year one students. With an eye to the future, is there the possibility that you'll be able to keep developing this tool out so that it incorporates the other year levels of primary school, for example?
Well, it's definitely needed. I mean, we started with foundation and year one, obviously, because that was mentioned specifically in BAF, so that we're all going to have an early years number check. So we knew that the need was there. However, we also know the importance of having a multi-tiered system of support right throughout schooling. And that requires a good universal screener. So although the initial need might be in the early years, there is going to be a need right through school for that kind of litmus test to say, who do I need to look more carefully on? Are you on track? Are you not? And then if you're not, right, let's follow up and do some more detailed diagnostic assessment. Because unfortunately, doing a once-off number check in year one or whenever it might be, it's not a vaccination for having difficulties down the track. So if we stop doing those evidence-based assessments after we've done one in year one, we're going to help some kids, but there'll be a lot who will have experiences, fall behind later on, and we possibly won't pick them up as quickly as we need to. That was the long answer to your question. The short answer is, I think that's really needed. We would like to be involved in that work. Of course, as I said, we're a not-for-profit organisation, so it very much depends on what people will support us to develop in terms of getting that funding to make that work happen.
So if we've got some philanthropists out there having a listen in today, we would appreciate your hard-earned money to develop a screener that continues right through primary school, at least, maybe even into year 8. That makes me think of the Dibbles, which we've taken into our repertoire of screening tools here at Sandhurst, and that screens right through to year 8. And so those students get a Dibbles assessment, screening 3 times a year, just to make sure that we're keeping on top of who might be falling through the cracks as they age and move through the schooling system. So the numeracy equivalent to that would be fantastic.
And that's the gold standard, right? I mean, it's not going to look exactly the same as Dibbles because unfortunately there is no oral reading fluency for maths. That's been really well established. We know that oral reading fluency right throughout primary school is a good kind of litmus test for overall reading achievement. We don't have one of those in maths, so we're not going to find one. So the skills that we measure, if we were to develop something equivalent for numeracy, they are going to change as children move through the school. So I said number sense for foundation in year 1, but we won't be testing number sense if we design one for year 4. It would be changing as the content of the maths curriculum changes. So we'd be moving into place value, multiplication, division. Fractions is a huge one. Fraction knowledge is the single biggest predictor of how children will do in high school. It would be fantastic to have something that was working in parallel.
Kelly, you mentioned fluency, and I'm becoming increasingly intrigued and knowledgeable, I suppose, in the role that fluency plays in learning full stop. You know, the quicker, the more automatically we can recall something, the great benefits it has on taking load off our working memory and where we do our thinking and problem solving and all that sort of stuff. So what's in numeracy and, looking at early years, what's that role of fluency? Where do you see that our teachers should be really thinking about what their students need to be fluent in as they're moving through our early primary years?
That's a really good question. And I think it's something that is really just gaining traction in terms of people being aware of how important it is to be fluent with prerequisite skills. We've been talking a lot in Australia, probably more so over the last 10 years or so, about cognitive load and how if all of those underlying skills are effortful, it really impacts on your ability to use those skills to either apply them to a novel problem or to use them to reason. So that's true for any skill, but I think it's especially true for maths because it is so hierarchical. So when we look at early childhood, there is still quite a lot of knowledge that children need to be fluent with. So we need to be very fluent with recognizing our numbers, with having an automatic activation of the magnitude of those numbers. So that's something that typically happens between around age 6 and age 8. It's like when you see a word flashed up on a screen. Have you ever done one of those Stroop tests where they have all these color words and they're written in different colors, and have the word green written in red, and they say, oh, you have to say the color and not the word.
Yes.
The reason that's hard is because you're an automatic reader. You read that word without intending to read that word, and you kind of have to inhibit that in order to say the color. Well, something similar happens with our numerals, that when you see the number 8, it becomes hardwired that you have all this knowledge that comes into working memory about number 8. It's more than 7, it's less than 9, it's half of 16, it's 2 less than 10, it's more than 2, and all of that automatic knowledge needs to be hardwired then for you to be able to use that number 8, for example, to solve a problem. Having that automaticity, not with just reading the numbers, but knowing their value, is really important. And we also know that knowing the value of those numbers automatically is extremely important for being able to have some fluency with number combinations. And I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody that having fluency with number combinations is extremely important, even from year 1. So whilst we know that we start exposing children to addition and subtraction through making collections and separating collections, if the children can become fluent then with knowing those small number combinations, it really enables them to concentrate on that problem solving and reasoning that needs to come to the fore when you present them with a problem, where the sheep ran out of the paddock or whatever it is, and they can engage with the structure of the problem and not be using all of their cognitive energy to say, oh, what's 6 take 2?
Yeah. Recently we've had Brian Ponce from the United States visiting our Australian shores, and I was lucky enough to see him present down at Melbourne. And he's done a lot of research on the role that factual recall, and he's produced a website called Facts on Fire, and the role that fluency in students been automatic in their multiplications, doubles, near doubles, all that addition, subtraction. He's really built his whole professional now identity around the fact that without this really solid foundation of fluency in basic maths facts, that we are depriving our students of what they need to be further successful in mathematics.
Absolutely. And I think the only people who say that fluency with those foundational skills doesn't matter are people who've never had an issue with fluency with those foundational skills. Because it's very, very hard to think and to reason if you don't have knowledge to think and reason with. If all of that knowledge is effortful, it's extremely difficult to apply it. So, if I watch a game of American football, gridiron, I can't reason about the strategy that they're using because I don't have any kind of fluency with the rules and how the game works. I don't have the knowledge to reason with. I think it's really crucial that we know that not all skills are created equal. And yes, obviously, understanding is important, reasoning is important, but you need knowledge to reason with.
I think, Kelly, too, the thing that really resonates so strongly with me, and the increasingly significant role that neuroscience is playing in the educational field, is that you can't outsource that knowledge just because you have a computer handy or a calculator handy. So what neuroscience has taught us, that our problem-solving capacity, our creativity capacity, comes down to what we have stored in long-term memory, not what we have outsourced to a device. So it's not good enough just to say you can look that up, because looking it up does nothing for your deeper sense of cognition. And look, we've had a podcast prior to this where I sat with Kate Fogarty, our executive director, and we talked about know better, do better. And I certainly 100% put my hand up to say I was a victim of thinking that I didn't want to teach my students those foundational skills because I was so interested in them having higher order thinking skills and being critical, creative problem solvers that's where I had to land with them. That's the space I had to put them in to be able to be that sort of person, that sort of learner. And I ignored the foundations that are absolutely critical for them to be able to be that sort of learner we would eventually like them to be. But you've got to put the foundations in place before you can start to do those other things.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that, Craig. I look back and there are a lot of things that I would do differently now with what I know. I'm not saying that I did a bad job, but I certainly could have done it better. I know that I talk too much, which is really surprising for a teacher, right? In the demonstration phase when I was teaching, I should have been an awful lot more concise with the language that I was using and a lot more premeditated with how I was using it, to control that cognitive load. And like you said, I really valued, well, what do you think? What are the different ways that you could solve this problem, without fully appreciating how important it was that I had explicitly taught them effective ways to solve that problem first, so that they could then go back and reflect on which one that they were going to choose or apply to this. So yeah, there are a lot of things that I would do differently too. And I'm quite comfortable with that because it means I'm learning.
Kelly, you mentioned the instructional hierarchy before, and we've got to circle back to it because, as I said, it's. I feel like it's my brand new child, the instructional hierarchy, but it's not your brand new child because, as you've said a couple of times in conversation with myself, that you were into the instructional hierarchy before it was cool.
That's right, before it was cool.
Yeah. So, without having to give too much detail, but what is it about it that drew you to it, and what do you think we could all learn from the instructional hierarchy?
I think it's really helpful the way it is so sequential. I came through teacher training at a time when we were all talking about outcomes-based education, and everything was a little bit fluffy and we weren't talking about prerequisite skills, and we moved from there in terms of talking about the proficiency strands, and we had understanding and we had fluency and we had problem solving and we had reasoning. And now there was a lot of very confusing messaging happening about, well, how many of these am I trying to hit at the same time? And do I have to do them in order? Or, can lesson 1 just have these 2 and lesson 2 has those 2? And I think what the instructional hierarchy did was, for me personally, it really helped to align what we all know is important in terms of, being able to reason and problem solve with mathematics with what we know about effective instruction in any skill. So I think the problem what we have with a lot of things is that we're adults. We've mastered a lot of skills. We look with rose-colored glasses and we think, oh, we should, propose these rich problem-solving tasks, and they'll be really motivating for students because they'll be able to come up with their own solutions, etc., etc. But we forget that there was a time that we didn't have the skills to be able to come up with those solutions. And if you are a person or a child who doesn't have those skills, it's anything but motivating and enjoyable. It's incredibly frustrating and demotivating. So I think the instructional hierarchy kind of acknowledges the importance of that generalization, but it says there's a pathway to getting there. You have to go through the acquisition stage first, and that's about being accurate and understanding what you're doing and how to make it work and how to get the right answer. And there are specific teaching techniques that work there. So we don't have to be this, explicit teaching good, rich problems bad. It doesn't have to be bipolar like that. It can be explicit teaching works for acquisition. In fact, it's excellent for acquisition. And we do a lot of acquisition in school because we're working with kids. And then once we've acquired, it's the fluency stage. It's practice, 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 practice. And I think so often, and I'm certainly guilty of this or have been in the past, because children have become accurate of like, right, done that, let's move on. And I haven't put that time into the practice so that it gets to the point of being fluent and automatic. And then I can start to reason and think with it. So I think often we have been mindful of the importance of building the understanding and the accuracy, and we've thought that that was all there was to it, or we've been mindful of doing the problem solving because we know that that's the holy grail of mathematics, but we haven't had a pathway to get from one to the other.
I couldn't agree more. And again, it emphasises fluency. It's not just about being accurate, it's about being able to recall that information quickly to be able to use it in the service of more difficult problem-solving type episodes that we might put in front of our students. So thanks for emphasising and explaining that so well, Kelly. Kelly, we're drawing towards the end, but there's just two other things I'd like just to pick your brains on. One is we're talking a lot about supporting students who are at risk, and about picking up on that risk early and intervening so that those students don't then suffer being behind mathematically for the rest of their schooling and perhaps the rest of their life. What about at the other end of the scale? And this is where some of our teachers might push back a little bit to say, are we doing enough to consider the needs of those higher achieving students that are in all of our classrooms as well? When we're talking about generalisation and adaptation in terms of instructional hierarchy, what resources or things would you suggest for teachers who know that their students have got it and they just need to be supported to be extended a little bit more? What comes to mind for you when you think of that space?
Yeah, so I think that's when it's really important to understand how your teaching strategies are appropriate to different stages of the instructional hierarchy. So in any class, you are going to have kids who are at acquisition phase on this particular skills, but you will have other children who are at the generalisation and adaptation phase. So those explicit teaching strategies that work really well for the novice students in your room, which most of your learners will be because they're little and they're at school, they won't be equally effective for your high flyers and the high achievers. We don't want to teach them to suck eggs. So I think those higher achievers, that's when your much more student-directed kind of exploration strategies can come in. If you know that they have acquired that skill, that they're accurate, that they're fluent, that's when you can start posing more open-ended problems and asking them for different ways to solve it and to reason and explain how they've come to their solution. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think a lot of that differentiation, if we're looking at explicit teaching focus, the I do, we do, you do, a lot of that differentiation I think could happen in the you do in terms of acknowledging where children are at in that instructional hierarchy, and maybe the you do looks different for those students. Maybe it is much more open-ended.
I love that, Kelly. The you do looks different depending on what you're capable of doing independently.
Yeah, and that's where we can pull out those kind of how many solutions are there kind of tasks when we are absolutely certain that this child is at the adaptation phase or at least at the generalisation phase of the instructional hierarchy, and we know that they have the skills to be doing that kind of reasoning. Just because we don't do it with everybody doesn't mean we can't do it with those particular students.
And there's some good websites out there that support teachers in being able to produce those sorts of questions that and those sort of open-ended problem-solving things.
Yeah, there are. And I think the easiest way to produce an open-ended problem is basically, instead of starting with the question and asking for the solution, is just work backwards.
Yeah, love it.
To say, here's the solution, what could the question be? Here's the solution, what are the ways you could, what could the problem be and what are the answers? But I just do want to emphasise, I suppose, that when we're talking about particularly primary schooling, the vast majority of our children don't spend a lot of time in that generalisation and adaptation phase of the instructional hierarchy. And that's why systems like Sandhurst and like your Magnify program have really concentrated on those explicit teaching strategies which suit the acquisition phase, because we do spend a lot of time there because we're young children and we're at school, and the role of schools is to teach children to acquire new skills. And that takes quite a bit of time. So I think it's important to have in your toolkit, but not to over-apply it.
When we've done a fair bit of work as a diocese with Dr. Jared Cooney-Horvath, an educational neuroscientist, used to be out here in Australia and is now based in America. But Jared talked about sort of as a rule of thumb, an 80-20 rule. He sort of said 80% of our time should be around supporting students with that accuracy, the acquisition and the fluency stage, and 20% of our time, give or take, and it's going to be different for different subjects, but 20% of our time supporting students then to apply, to problem solve, and to immerse themselves in that sort of upper end of the learning, if you like. Rule of thumb, there's nothing concrete in that, so please don't anyone go away from here saying, right, it's 80-20, but it's just a way of thinking about it. Kelly, I've kept you for a while today. This conversation's been brilliant. It's gone on a little longer than I expected, so I just want to finish off with asking you about who are the influences out there in this whole thinking about mathematics that you perceive as being really knowledgeable and someone worth investing some time in as an educator who wants to upskill and up-knowledge themselves, so to speak?
I like that word, acknowledge. I'm going to use that. Well, you've said one of them already. I would definitely put Dr. Brian Ponce on that list, particularly for his work, of course, in fluency. He's dedicated here his entire professional life to studying fact fluency. So I don't think anybody knows more than Dr. Brian Ponce about that. Dr. Robin Cotting is another one. She's not quite as easy to find on podcasts and such, but I quite often keep my eye on Patan, the Patan website. They have an online conference on evidence-based mathematics every year, which is normally around May, June from memory. And they have people like Brian Ponce, Robin Cotting, Amanda van der Hayden. I'm not sure if Anna Stockey's been on there yet, but I'm sure she'd be on their list. So that's a really good one to look out for. And they do also have a kind of a library of previous presentations that can be freely accessed.
That sounds great. You mentioned a couple of big names there, Amanda van der Hayden and Anna Stockey. So they've been very influential in my thinking as well. And we've had 50 of our teachers across the diocese start a maths short course on the science of maths, which Anna is helping to lead. So that's fantastic for 50 of our teachers out there in Sandhurst.
Yeah, very lucky. And I think Dr. Nancy Jordan is another one to keep an eye out for, although she's not nearly as visible on social media as others. Nobody knows more about number sense than Nancy Jordan does. And she also does some fantastic work on fractions.
Okay, Nancy Jordan, we'll add that one to our podcast notes. Kelly, thanks so much for joining us today. You've been a wealth of knowledge. It's been wonderful talking to you. And as we go about embarking on our first engagement with the ENSA, we thank you for your work in that and for what it's going to provide for us in terms of supporting the mathematical growth for all of the students who go through our Sandhurst school. So thank you so much. And we look forward to continuing to work with you as we continue this mission that we are on to improve the learning outcomes for every student that attends a school in Sandhurst.
Important mission that is. Thanks so much, Craig. And I'm really looking forward to working with all your teachers.
That's it for this episode of Magnify Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about great teaching and learning. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we magnify what truly matters.